Too big to fail is probably one of the most questionable principles of modern capitalism, and while I don't plan to get political today, we are, however, talking about one of the more political games in the franchise, that is, Final Fantasy VII. Or, more accurately, its remake. Too big to fail is probably how most fans would describe any attempts to remake Final Fantasy VII. Being without a doubt the most iconic and culturally significant game in the franchise, for Square Enix to shit the bed in attempts to revisit this classic would surely put the company at death throes. Or would it? Remake was far from a disaster. If anything, as the most current mainline game, it's in many ways a return to form for the series, with combat and characters both universally praised. And then at the exact same time, it's yet again a reminder that the company is a shadow of its former self, with wonky storytelling and level design that remain subpar for the industry, which oddly enough is the entire point of the remake. And so with that, we'll be looking at the good, the bad, and the excellent of Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's weird to think that this franchise was traditionally known for its incredible stories and turn-based combat, when in reality the last mainline title to play turn by turn was released almost 20 years ago, and every Final Fantasy game's narrative after 10 has been something of a mixed bag. Even the MMOs have varying quality in their writing, ranging from downright boring to exceptional, and Remake continues the status quo. I have plenty of thoughts on the narrative, but we'll focus on combat for now, which I'm honestly shocked that it took Square Enix this long to cook up the deceptively simple combat of Final Fantasy VII. The game really doesn't play all that differently from the original, if I'm being honest. Each character has an ATB that fills slowly over the course of a fight, but this can be hastened with the use of normal attacks. Once the bar is filled, you can use it to access your tactical menu for combat commands. Just like the original Final Fantasy VII, when you open the tactical menu, time slows to a crawl for players to make their selections, not unlike Mass Effect 2's Power Wheel, the radio menu in Spider-Man. The only big difference is the inclusion of real-time action elements when you're waiting for the ATB to recharge. Characters can freely move about the battlefield, running, dodging, and blocking. Players can also swap to other party members on the fly or issue them commands through the tactical menu. The joy of Remake's combat is a system of menus that guide players between frenetic, action-packed battles with cool, thoughtful selections of abilities, items, and party commands. It's the perfect blend of the original game's turn-based selections and more modern action sequences of contemporary RPGs. One of the biggest failings of modern Final Fantasy through the lens of a traditional fan were the experimental battle systems implemented with each new game, each falling short of the lofty expectations set by their predecessors. Remake takes this challenge in stride, learning from the mistakes of those who came before. Where Final Fantasy XV was too action-oriented, lacking the series' traditional battle tactics, Remake allows for plenty of button mashing but still gives you a full menu for classic Final Fantasy options. Where 13 was overly streamlined, Remake allows for full customization of your party members through the classic materia system. Where Final Fantasy XII was overly automated, Remake allows for the party member AI to engage enemies with basic attacks, consigning the use of their ATB skills entirely to the player's discretion, ensuring you'll always have a steady list of meaningful choices to make throughout combat and incentivizing players to regularly switch party members. The variety of Final Fantasy combat doesn't end at limits in materia. Boss fights and combat encounters are designed so that no party member is consistently dominant. Cloud is a powerful heavy hitter against grounded foes, but you'll have a far easier time with airborne enemies using Barret and Aerith, who employ long-range gunfire and magical projectiles respectively. The addition of new character-specific weapon commands and secondary abilities also give party members more defined roles. For example, Aerith has magical circles that provide party support, like extended spellcasting or ATB regeneration, and Barret's tank-like abilities can buff his own defense and take damage in place of party members. Boss fights take combat to a whole nother level, with unique mechanics to learn, mini cutscenes for transition during battles, as well as enhanced music for each phase that all come together to create a flashy and cinematic experience without sacrificing the tactical feel of the game's menu-based combat. And with that, I'd say, yeah, Square Enix certainly lived up to the ambitions of bringing Final Fantasy VII into the modern age. Over the past two console generations, Final Fantasy has had the very unique position of really being the only AAA JRPG. Some games come close in production value like Xenoblade 2 or Persona 5, however, despite having several times the money and man-hours behind it, Remake falls short of its contemporaries whenever the battle theme fades. World design is an absolute mess, the game's more linear than its decade-old predecessor Final Fantasy XIII, and the hallway that's supposed to serve as the backdrop to bring the game's world into the modern age has textures that would feel more at home in the 1997 original. As someone who not only predicted but was excited for a Banner of Revolution game, I couldn't wait to see how Square Enix would expand on the city. Final Fantasy XV was an open world with highways, cars, pit stops, and other modern trappings for a modern fantasy. I was hoping we'd get the same with Remake, something akin to GTA Midgar. The original game's Midgar section can be completed in about 5 hours, so to turn that into a full-scale RPG meant they'd have to expand on it. The very nature of Remake meant it had to be different, and I not only welcomed but expected these changes. More visits to the upper plates, more reactor bombings, more motorcycle sequences, more stairs? Okay, maybe not more stairs, but really I expected to be able to explore Midgar top to bottom, since that was all we were getting. More of this and less of this. More of this and less of this. But instead of actually expanding on Midgar in a meaningful way, Remake chooses to waste our time with meaningless filler, taking areas that took minutes to traverse in the original and blowing them up to sprawling dungeons that can at times feel like a slog to get through. Especially when Remake has the audacity to make you go through them twice. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Leslie. There are some sections which are expanded in relevant ways, like Wall Market, a level which was originally designed by Motomo Teriyama, who returned to oversee the remake's rendition of Midgar's Red Light District. This section is heralded by many as the best example of the sort of modernization Final Fantasy VII needed. Funny how the Final Fantasy XIII guy quite possibly oversaw the best part of the game. As disappointed as I was with Remake's paltry depiction of Midgar, I think the biggest misstep was the addition of certain new themes and plot elements. And yeah, I'm talking about the plot ghosts. Believe me, I'm just as tired of talking about them as y'all are. There are many who believe the Arbiters of Fate to be a metaphor for fans' expectations, how purist fans may be unwilling to see the remake deviate in any way or form from the original, and the pressure that sets on the development team, acting as a sort of meta-commentary on the very nature of remakes themselves. I think that's an odd point worth making, and personally, I think this is giving them too much credit. Remakes, whether or not we're talking about video games, film, or what have you, are a decades-old prospect. I look to another famous remake, John Carpenter's The Thing, heralded as one of the greatest sci-fi films of all time. The Thing follows an Antarctic research team's attempts to contain and destroy a long-frozen alien discovered in the Antarctic ice. Sound familiar? Unlike Square Enix, Carpenter doesn't waste time soaking to the audience through poorly thought-out metaphors or the pressure of remaking a classic film, and instead masterfully tells the story of an alien monster who slowly infects and assimilates the Antarctic crew. While Remake does a decent job of retelling the banner of revolution, much like John Carpenter's film, something feels off as you slowly make your way through Midgar. Players are haunted by ghostly apparitions that disrupt the original and expanded events of the game, like the glimpses of body horror throughout Carpenter's film. As the Thing slowly stalks and attacks the scientists, things come to a head when Avalanche finally take on the threat of the Arbiters at the source in order to challenge fate and take their destiny into their own hands. The reveal comes much like the bullet test scene in Carpenter's Thing, in which it's revealed that despite being tied up with the rest of the crew side by side, Palmer has been assimilated by the alien and begins attacking his peers. The very nature of Remake isn't far off from the monster terrorizing the Antarctic scientists, pretending to be something it's not. At times, the game appears as a genuine retelling of the beloved title from all those years ago, only to spring its alien tentacles on unsuspecting viewers in the form of plot ghosts carrying out the planet's will. It's all very Kingdom Heartsy and leaves a really bad taste in the mouth, especially since I've disliked the direction of that series since 2012's Dream Drop Distance, and with how disappointing Kingdom Hearts 3 was, I was finally ready to hop off Nomura-san's wild ride, only to be led right back on it with Remake. Final Fantasy VII is already so chock full of great themes to explore, such as environmentalism, capitalism, coping with loss, and there's probably some others I'm forgetting. But adding the additional themes of defying fate through plot ghosts and alternate timelines, I can't help but look back at Kingdom Hearts and the issues that series faced with time-traveling retcons and the 8 different niggas who look like Sora, and you start to see why I feel giving Nomura and Nojima credit for creating any sort of weighty commentary on the very nature of remakes seems about as sound as equipping heirs with the provoked materia. And even if that is exactly what they're doing here, is that even really a point worth making? The Arbiters of Fate also serve the equally unfortunate purpose of giving a canon reason for why the remake is different, which, when we pull up the definition of remake, verb, make something again or differently. Again, the remake is broken up into multiple parts. And if each installment is supposed to be the length of a full game, it stands to reason that new content will have to be added in order to give players a feeling of actually playing a full-length mainline title. Square Enix never need to justify things being different in the first place, as the very nature of remakes themselves, especially with how they're going about this one, means a significant amount of content needs to be added or expanded anyway. So all the crazy plot ghost shenanigans and giant monsters with multiple forms JRPG bullshit is a moot point. until we get to a scene that's either the worst or best of the game, depending on how you feel about a particularly pointy-haired prequel protagonist. And it's at this point you realize things in Remake aren't different in the same sense as Scarface or John Carpenter's The Thing different. Things might just be different in a rebuild of Evangelion kind of way different. As in, this might be a lot more than just a remake kind of different. Like, this might be a continuation of the 1997 original different. That Square Enix has now thrown out the whole premise to recreate the original so that modern gamers who never got to play it could now experience these characters in their world without the off-putting graphics of the PS1. Because as a possible sequel or continuation, they're now required to either go back and play the original or read a plot summary on the wiki in order to have the context to make sense of what's actually going on. But I think what really jostles my Jeremies the most is that once you actually beat the game, it becomes abundantly clear that Square Enix was never really interested in remaking Final Fantasy VII. I mentioned before about how Square Enix uses the defeat of the plot ghost as a canon means to make changes and completely alter the storyline of Final Fantasy VII. Meaning, if later installments aren't drastically different, then the conflict with the Arbiters of Fate was completely meaningless. And I guess it's the part that concerns me the most. I'm not confident in modern Square's storytelling. There are certainly some standouts like Nier or Final Fantasy XIV, but none of the creative forces behind those games are working on Remake. And when I look at how disappointing Kingdom Hearts has been, how unfulfilling Final Fantasy XV was, or how 13's plot was barely serviceable, I'm just not quite confident in the unknown journey of Final Fantasy VII. Moving on to a more positive note, if there's anything the remake gets right, it's the characters. I think a concern many had for the game's release was how authentic Tifa and Cloud and the rest of Avalanche would be compared to their 1997 counterparts. Especially since Square Enix has been distilling the game's conflicting characters, specifically Cloud and Sephiroth, into an extremely generic shonen rival-like trope. It's especially apparent in games like Kingdom Hearts 2 or World of Final Fantasy, where it's damn near all they talk about. Over the past 2 decades, the game's characters have been elevated to the status of pop culture icons, and while the likes of Tifa, Aeris, and Sephiroth have taken up permanent residence in the collective conscience of gamers the world over, those versions that so many are familiar with are mere caricatures of the protagonists you get to know over the course of the actual game. And while Square Enix storytelling has been downright abysmal for the last decade, they found a new niche in surprisingly believable character writing. This is probably my favorite thing about Final Fantasy XV. While the game initially lacks series staples such as playable party members and actual character arcs for said party members, the Chocobros feel surprisingly realistic, despite each character hitting a particular trope dead on. It's how each character's personality is executed that makes them feel like true brothers in arms. So it was a delight to see that Square Enix continued the trend of fantastic character writing for Final Fantasy VII Remake, actually remembering who those characters truly are while also giving them a facelift for 2020. The original game lacked voice acting, so crude, almost slapstick-like animations were used to bring the Lego-like eco-terrorists to life. It was through the combination of these cartoonish animations and blue text boxes that players felt the heat of Barrett's fervor to save the planet or Aerith's flirty playfulness in the slums. In 2020, you get a real sense of Cloud and Barrett's relationship through copious amounts of banter. The Guard Scorpion, the very first fight in the game, is chock full of witty back and forth between the two. The amount of battle banter does begin to drop off as you delve deeper into the game, but there's still plenty of great characterization, especially in your party's vernacular. Avalanche swears like sailors. Even your plucky white mage character can't help but let one slip out when she's in danger. Cloud himself is also very similar to Noctis in his attempts to act way too cool than he actually is, and really just comes off as a dork or an asshole depending on the situation. Barrett has a near religious-like zeal, often going off on rant/sermons preaching to the party about the dangers of Mako energy, giving his crew the pep talks they need whenever they may have doubts about their sacred crusade against the Shinra Electric Power Company. For all intents and purposes, Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't a bad game. Combat is the best the series has had in over a decade, and with the combat system combining ATB menus and hack-and-slash elements, battles are flashy enough to entertain modern gamers without alienating old-school fans. And while I wholeheartedly believe that devoting an entire game to the banner of Revolution was the right choice, missteps in level design and the choice to enact Kingdom Hearts levels of convoluted storytelling are more than a little off-putting, and make it seriously difficult to argue in Square's favor on the decision. Luckily, the charmingly modern rendition of Final Fantasy VII's classic characters is almost always enough to keep me entertained, even when the game's world design leaves much to be desired. But hopefully Square Enix can take what they've learned from Part 1 and give us the guide we deserve when they finally adapt Pursuit for Part 2. Hey, shouts out to anyone who made it to the end of the video. Again, these things just keep getting longer and longer, and honestly, I need to apologize to you guys for making you all wait for so long. It's been like, what, almost a month? Maybe a little longer, actually. I'm sorry about that. I just need to find a better work, like actual work, life, and content creation balance. I'll get it down eventually. Shouts out to Corey Shea, or the Nerdy Artist, as he's known on Twitch, because did the artwork for my thumbnail for the video, and I'm gonna link all his stuff in the bio, in the description down below. Shouts out to Chatting Myth. He sent me my new mic. I didn't use it for the video, I didn't have it at the time, but I am using it to record my end slate here, and I'll be using it for future stuff. And honestly, I'm getting a whole brand new setup all together, so you know, might even consider streaming myself. Who knows what the future holds. But yeah, like, favorite, subscribe, all that good stuff, and see you guys in the next video.